We could talk about Abyssinian Baptist Church, right? Reverend Adam Clayton Powell, who preached against homosexuality and all manner of sex perversions in Harlem. But this is a general phenomenon. Now you add to that, in addition to state repression, church repression, we also have racial oppression. That is the construction of, in this case, black men as beasts, as brutes, as deviant, as threatening, right? This dangerous black man, you see these caricatures of the time, or How Sleeps the Beast. It says, the man, Negro, the girl, white, the payoff, lynch. Pretty straightforward, right? And that brings us to lynching, right? Lynching was widespread. This is the practice of extrajudicial mob murder of black people, overwhelmingly black men, but of course some black women were also lynched. And they would literally, take pictures and send postcards of lynchings. And the other painful thing about this is the castration, right? Oftentimes lynchings included castration. And it was, as I said, a very widespread phenomenon. I'm assuming we all are familiar with this, but just for anyone who isn't, this is another layer to the sexual repression that's happening at the time. So this brings us to Audre Lorde. And we've spoken about her here, and I think it's important to invoke her as well. Particularly her piece on the uses of the erotic. She says, in order to perpetuate itself, every oppression must corrupt or distort those various sources of power within the culture of the oppressed that can provide an energy for change. For women, this has meant a suppression of the erotic as a considered source of power and information within our lives. And of course, she is speaking about, the suppression of women's erotic energy. There's a long history of this. From female genital mutilation, witch burnings, chastity belts, and so on and so forth. And of course, for black women, there's another layer, which is the stereotypes and tropes, like the Jezebel, for example, in which black women are being hypersexualized, or the mammy, in which black women are desexualized. But what strikes me about Lorde's quote, is that for women, this has meant a suppression of the erotic, but also for black men. And so when we think about lynching, right, David Marriott reminds us that the taking of photographs at mass lynchings, the taking of body parts, the most prized being the black penis, seem to have been central to the compulsively ritualized ways of looking at black men's body at the moment of annihilation. And basically this idea that this is a legalized violation of kinship structures, the forcible interruption of black patrilineal succession, excluding black men and boys from the father's name, the father's law, constantly renews itself through an initiatory economy of legalized castration and communal ritual. So it's a suppression of black masculine erotic power when you're lynching and castrating people literally twice a week in Harrison's day. And so these are some of the layers to understand why Harrison is so extraordinary, right? To be in a society that has all this state repression, all this church repression, all this anti-black sexualized oppression, to come out as a black free lover in that context. It's not a game, it's the real risks, including the risk of lynching, right? And Harrison was a lynch mob survivor. That's another story for another day. So let me just go to, he talked about the materialistic interpretation of morals. This is basically the idea that, if you look at the evolution of society, that basically sex morality is the morality of those in power, what they want to have being moral and immoral. And that monogamy becomes this sort of centerpiece because they want to know who to pass down. The ruling class wants to know who to pass down their wealth to, right? So having that paternity certainty is part of their interest in monogamy. And therefore, the behaviors that are considered moral are basically depending on what serves the interests of the ruling class. And as Harrison writes in a review of this book, Puritanism, by a fellow socialist, Clarence Miley, he says, the custodians of morality and divine grace, such as intellectuals and priests, did not contribute directly to economic production, and therefore they get income from the ruling class. And because they're paid, because they get that that payment, they're determining law and morality in the interest of he who's paying the piper, right? And so what this means for Harrison is that while the workers are toiling and suffering, the learning of the lawyer and the piety of the priest would be thrown into the scale against them. The state would bind their bodies, while the church would bind their souls. Law, morality, and religion would link themselves together in one tyrannical trinity for the exploitation of the proletariat. So seeing this sexual repression as part of a larger system of oppression in which, the society is arrayed against working people. Now, I mentioned European social science. This is another fascinating thing about Harrison, is he was so widely read. He used to read multiple books a day. He had a genius-level intellect, and he was integrating all this information from European social science. People like Lewis Henry Morgan, Engels, there's a whole number of people he's reading. And their basic message is that monogamy is the mark of civilization, right? That it's the most advanced stage of human development, which of course only modern white European Christian quote-unquote civilization had achieved. And what's crazy about this idea is that these guys actually studied the whole world, right? They looked at all these different civilizations and societies, ethnologists, anthropologists, evolutionary biologists. I mean, they studied people, the Australian Aborigines, people in the Pacific and the South Pacific. They studied indigenous peoples in Central and South America and Africa, in Asia. And instead of saying, well, this suggests that all these people who are practicing polygamy or that don't have monogamy as the hegemonic or compulsory requirement in their society, right? Instead of saying like, well, all these people are doing this other stuff, maybe that's more natural, or maybe that corresponds better to how humans have lived for most of our history, their conclusion is, oh, these people are all savages because they've not achieved monogamy, right? And this insight here, I want to shock you, because it really shocked me when it hit me. Patricia Dixon Spear, she's one of the few people that I know in terms of black scholars who've really worked on non-monogamy in black communities. This book, We Want for Our Sisters What We Want for Ourselves. She says, it was not until after the 15th century, with European world conquest and domination, that the idea of polygyny as an inferior marriage practice and monogamy as the superior marriage practice came to dominate the world, right? In other words, the Europeans had this idea of monogamy as superior, and they colonized the rest of the world from the 15th century onward, and that's how the rest of the world came to see monogamy as superior and everything else as inferior. I think that's really, really profound and something we need to sit with. And I think Harrison, if he didn't make this argument, he probably really understood it and actually might have made this argument given his knowledge. For example, he looked at people like Edward Wilmot Blyden, who's been mentioned here, right, from St. Thomas, neighboring Virgin Island. Edward Wilmot Blyden's book, African Life and Customs, talks about plural marriage in Africa, about how African economic life was naturally cooperative, not egoistic or individualistic, right? That it's about we and not I for African people. And Harrison said that this was perhaps his most valuable book, Blyden's most valuable book. Blyden talks about how the foundation of the African family is plural marriage, and contrary to the general opinion, this marriage rests upon the will of the woman because it lightened her workload in the home, allowing for collective cooperation with regard to the reproductive labor of cooking, cleaning, child rearing, and so on. This idea that it takes a village to raise a child. As the Haitians say, right? Men en pile chai palo. Many hands make the load lighter. And then this also, I think, given that it's Pride Month, we need to talk actually about the wide-ranging African sexualities on the continent, right? The Dagara people, for example, of Burkina Faso, they talk about the gatekeepers, what we might think of in a Western frame as LGBT, but these are people who they saw as having a spiritual connection to the divine and the keys to these gates between this world and the spirit world. We could talk about the Imangala people of Angola who had men and women's apparel. We could talk about the person pictured here, King Mwanga II of Buganda, what is modern day Uganda, an openly gay monarch in Africa. And the work of people like Dr. Tamale, who've done a lot to sort of show the range of sexualities in Africa before colonization, before monogamy and Europeans came and were imposed as the only standard and the only respectable form. So, getting back to Harrison, one of the things that people would say about free love is, well, yeah, that sounds nice, but what about the kids? They don't have any say in all this promiscuity and free love that you're talking about. So Harrison, as I mentioned, one of the things he's really should be better known for is being a pioneering black voice in the movement for access to contraception. Margaret Sanger is, of course, one of the figures in this period who does a lot to popularize this notion, and Harrison and Sanger were in the same branch of the Socialist Party. This is before Margaret Sanger became very elitist and sort of problematic in her views, which I'm sure many of us know about if we've looked at this question. But one of the things she does, Sanger writes this pamphlet when she's still a radical and a socialist. She writes this pamphlet called What Every Girl Should Know. And as you might remember, one of Harrison's lectures was called, Is Birth Control Hurtful or Helpful? Which is what every woman should know, right? Whether birth control is helpful or hurtful. What Sanger spoke about, we don't have a transcript of these talks by Harrison, so that's why I had to try and reconstruct what he was thinking and saying. But we know, based on what Sanger was saying at the time, she dedicated this book to the working girls of the world. Her series talked about all these different topics. Great. Physical and mental aspects of sexual health, sexual development in adolescence and puberty, the female sex organs, ovulation, menstruation, sexual desire and attraction, a whole number of things that she felt every girl should know. And because Harrison was in the same Socialist Party branch, and because he was surely reading all the series and pamphlets that Sanger was producing and involved in conversations with his comrades there, we can imagine that any number of these topics were ones that he was also speaking about as he was talking about birth control. Harrison did not, let me be clear, Harrison did not base his case for birth control on the kind of elitist notions that some people did, this notion that, oh yeah, birth control is great because it'll limit the population of the unfit, right? That was a very common way of arguing for birth control. All right, I'm wrapping up. I promise. There's one other figure I want to introduce from Harrison's circle, and that's this person called Edwin C. Walker. Edwin C. Walker was a free lover, a free thinker, and a free speecher. Oftentimes these things went together, right? Because just to be a free lover, you almost had to be a free speech advocate because the government could censor you, right, and criminalize your speech. So you know, if you wanted to do that, you kind of had to do this. Walker was 34 years older than Harrison. He founded the Sunrise Club, which Harrison was a member of. It was sort of this intellectual debating and just sort of engagement society, like a political intellectual salon. And Walker wrote pamphlets about these things, about free love. And so some of the things that I think Harrison might have thought, given his association with Walker, Walker makes this point that no single romantic partner is likely to be able to fulfill all of another person's sexual and emotional and intellectual and financial and romantic and social and political and spiritual needs. That's a tall order. It works for some people, but it's a lot. You know, most humans have a variety of needs, and so to meet those needs, it makes some sense in Walker's view to have a variety of relationships. And his conclusion is that monogamy represents an undeveloped or backward kind of physical, emotional, intellectual, and social state, rather than this sort of advanced pinnacle of human achievement that the Eurocentric scientists saw it as. Another interesting part of Walker's case, he said monogamy means possession, and possession basically means slavery. And he says we're not happy when we are jealous, and we're sure to be jealous if we believe in a zero-sum conception of love based on the exclusive possession of a lover. And by honestly accepting freedom of affection and variety, according to Walker, we realize we can hold all that is ours and no more, and will cease to rave and murder out of jealousy. I know, it's It's an interesting argument. We can talk more about it in discussion. I just want to get to the end of what I have to say. He says, variety in romance exerts a moderating and comforting influence because if something happens to one of the partners, or if one partner dies, then the blade of grief could be dulled because you have other people to support you, other people to care for you, other people to lift you up. And therefore, romantic and sexual variety offers a pathway to greater emotional support, emotional resilience, healing, and things of that nature. And then he had a joke. I love this joke. He said, Protestants, mostly accept without question this idea of marriage after the death of a romantic companion, thus practically announcing themselves in favor of monogamy here, but of polygamy in heaven. So to wrap up, Harlem, again, we have to understand the context of Harlem in this period and how Harrison's arguing and relating to a milieu of the world that is happening around him. This same Richard Bruce Nugent, who reported Harrison having a huge erotica collection, he said, people did what they wanted to do with whom they wanted to do it. You didn't get on the rooftops and shout, I fucked my wife last night. So why would you get on the rooftop and say, I love prick? You didn't. You just did what you wanted to do. Nobody was in the closet. There wasn't any closet. And to me, what that means is that basically people would do what they wanted to do without adopting an identity, right? Or putting a label on it. In the way that we think of you're a L or a G or a B or a T or whatever it might be. Like, people just did what they wanted to do without necessarily needing to take on a category and an identity. Here's another, this is a friend of Richard Bruce Nugent. He said, in the Harlem of the 20s, one could move in a social matrix in which the existence of extramarital sexual relationships of all kinds, homosexual and heterosexual, were taken for granted. The matrix was defined by sophisticated modern attitudes and a general rejection of conventional sexual mores, not by sexual orientation. So people weren't relating based on what their orientation was, but just in a more fluid type of fashion. So here's my wrap up. I know I'm speaking a lot, but when I tried to put all this together, right, what is Harrison teaching us about a radical black free love politics? He's making connections between the world historic subordination of women within class-divided societies, the oppression of compulsory monogamy as a mechanism for preserving the private property of the ruling class, the sex-negative morality and shaming from the church, which we spoke about, this history of Comstockian sexual repression by the government, and all these laws that they created to criminalize everything sexual. Capitalism's creation of those who must work for a wage, including women and others who get sort of forced into sex work because of desperate circumstances. The traumatization of black sexual vitality because of the widespread rape of black women and lynching of black men that's going on at this time, which eviscerates the erotic and life-generative power of black people, as Audre Lorde was saying, the suppression of the erotic. And then, of course, the role of imperialism in violently imposing this stuff all over the world, right? In Africa, in the Caribbean, in Latin America, in Asia. If we can hold all of this in one frame, I think there's something very Caribbean about Harrison's multifaceted, multidimensional way of thinking, way of understanding the world. It's creolized, yeah? It's mixed up. If we can hold all of this in our minds, I think we're stepping towards what he understood or surely would have been able to piece together, even though we don't have the transcripts of his actual talks. So last slide, I promise. The message I really want to leave you with is that the struggle for a love that is radical, healing, and limitless as blackness itself is part and parcel of the struggle for black and Pan-African liberation, women's liberation, decolonization, and the emancipation of labor. Thank you.
Thank you. So that's the next generation of Hubert Harrison scholarship. Wow, it's impressive. Right. And there's really interesting work coming out about his the legal arguments he makes in his work as well, which I was just reading an article. So in the other generation that did all that work on the Caribbean radical intellectual tradition is Professor Brian Meeks. Please, Professor Meeks, respond, take the floor. Yeah. And then after that, we'll have conversation and questions from the audience.
Hello, can you hear me? Yeah. Congratulations, Dr. Chen, if you're still in the room. I don't know if she's still here, on finishing your term. And I just want to echo Carol's point about how difficult these things are, and to thank you. Carol Boyce Davis for inviting me here, an old friend from way back when. And really glad to be here. And to Brian for that absolutely brilliant talk. And leaving insights that will be reflected in gaps in what I'm about to say, which I'm quite willing to correct at any moment in time. My talk is completely different, and it moves out into a wider frame, and it's called Thinking About the Black Radical Tradition. So hopefully it complements Brian in ways which are useful. But let me begin with a caveat. When Carol Boyce Davies asked me to speak at the CSA on her roundtable, I demurred, as while I admire and am influenced by Hubert Harrison's work, and while it would afford me time to do further reading around Harrison and his times, I readily admit I am no expert on Harrison. She insisted, however, that I come, and I suggested that I could speak on the black radical tradition, to which she added, "What about adding Caribbean to the title?" I thought about this for a long time, but arrived in contrarian fashion to the conclusion that if we are speaking about a certain 20th century black radical tradition, then it is difficult to disaggregate it into Caribbean and non-Caribbean components. Yes, we can identify where people came from and where they mainly agitated, organized, and developed their ideas. But beyond that, it becomes more complicated. Let's call a few names from a far from complete list to try to make this point. Malcolm X, Stokely Carmichael, Franz Fanon, Claudia Jones, Cyril Briggs, Suzanne Césaire, Aimé Césaire, W.A. Domingo, Audre Lorde, C.L.R. James, George Padmore, Claude McKay, Amy Ashwood Garvey, Otto Heathwood, Ras McConnell, and Hubert Harrison. These people, all I'm sure are well known to persons in this audience, are all from the Caribbean. I've kind of done a little sleight of hand and included Malcolm X and Audre Lorde, who are second generation. But I suggest that while it is a worthwhile exercise to consider why the Caribbean cohort played such an inordinate leadership role in black thought and black movements of the 20th century, I think this is a discussion for another day. But it is also impossible to neatly corral them off, indeed disaggregate them from this other list. Again, one that is presented here and is far from inclusive. W.B. Du Bois, William Monroe Trotter, Paul Robeson, Nnamdi Azikiwe, Huey Newton, Angela Davis, Kwame Nkrumah, Steve Biko, Amilcar Cabral, and Thomas Sankara. It is impossible, I propose, because this list, incomplete as it is, suggests an interlinked, intertwined history of traveling, sharing, corresponding, agitating for common causes, and thinking across colonial boundaries, all directed against racism, capitalism, colonialism, and in many instances against their neo-colonial successors. So in brief summary, I am far happier with our conceptual focus being on the global black radical tradition and to emphasize its interconnectedness, certainly in this brief moment as I raise a number of questions. The first question then is why radical, and Brian will hear echoes of what he said earlier on. Radical derives, as is well known, from the Latin radix, or root, suggesting that radicals went to the root, the foundation of existing social and political problems and sought to root them out. If we are to think of radicalism in this way, then black radicalism indubitably began with the slave trade and on the plantation and is embodied in those who resisted, who were committed to rooting it out via the panoply of forms of engagement and disengagement, by running away, foot dragging, poisoning, and most potent of all, by insurrection. But even with the one decisively successful model of insurrection, the Haitian Revolution, it is useful to pause on the distinction between degrees of commitment to a radical agenda. That is an agenda of rooting out. So we can think of Toussaint at the beginning and how he evolved, or the increasing gap between Toussaint and his nephew Moïse, as to how fast and in what direction the movement should proceed, or ultimately how Dessalines moved to the historic conclusion that independence was the only path going forward. To remember that there's no fixed definition of radicalism, and what may be far to the left, to use the French, unfortunately to use the French revolutionary references, today may be hopefully conservative and lagging behind the popular will tomorrow. There is, in other words, no fixed definition of what it means to be a radical. All this is to take us where I want to go in my remaining minutes, which is to say that black radicalism really is a set of ideas and practices about freedom, about liberation, about defining what is the human, which as Padmore, James, Rodney, Robinson, Winter, Bogues, Makalani, Kelly, Addy, and so many others have argued, goes back to the 16th century, precedes the consolidation of capitalism and global imperialism, and therefore cannot be subsumed within them, nor within the primary ideational bodies of thought that have emerged to resist and overcome capital. To put it another, perhaps cruder way, black struggle precedes the proletarian struggle. Which brings me quite intentionally to my second query. What precisely is the relationship between the black radical tradition and Marxism? First, to return briefly to my point just made, global black radicalism precedes the emergence of modern capital. Marx says as much when he says in Capital that the, quote, commercial hunting of black skins in Africa signaled the rosy dawn of the capitalist era of production. Of course, he was being sarcastic. But Marx is unable, I suggest, beyond this insightful recognition, to elaborate on the meaning of this for the future trajectory of these people and their descendants, or why even he chooses to use the phrase black skins to describe Africans and not Igbo, Congo, Fon, etc. In other words, their own names embodying histories and memories of real nations. Let us remember that there are few individuals or movements of black people in the 20th century that were not overtly Marxist or influenced by Marxism. Garvey and the UNIA, we might suggest, but Brian has just clearly told us that this is not entirely the case. Along with overtly religious movements, we might argue the Nation of Islam, perhaps Rastafari most notably, are important exceptions that demand and deserve a separate discussion beyond the purposes of this brief conversation. This is in itself cause for significant theorizing. What is it that Marxism brought to the table that made it so attractive to black radicals? The first I suggest is that Marx, using the dialectic as the foundation of his methodology, elaborated a compelling theory to both explain the powerful, exploitative, rapacious hold of capital and its political system of colonialism, imperialism over the world and its peoples. But critically, he also proposed that in the logic of the dialectic, this seemingly immovable object was inevitably transient and must eventually be transcended. This remarkable prediction stroke prognostication gave hope to toilers and oppressed people worldwide in proposing a route to the inevitable downfall of oppression. But I suggest that the second and more powerful attraction was only indirectly from Marx, and it was the October Bolshevik Revolution in Russia in 1917. October demonstrated that it was possible to overthrow one of the most powerful white European powers, and by a movement that was stridently anti-capitalist. This was immediately followed by Lenin's and the Bolsheviks' declaration of the rights to self-determination of the vassal states of the Russian Empire, and somewhat later at the various congresses of the Third International, the overt declaration of support for colonized people in Africa and Asia and for the oppressed, quote-unquote, Negro peoples of America and beyond. The powerful magnetic pull of Marxism and of the emergent Soviet Republic can only be grasped in this context, and to quote David Scott, this problem space. In a world of rampant exploitation, scientific racism, Jim Crow and Ku Klux Klan terror, and the carnage and devastation of an imperialist war, the Bolsheviki, utilizing Marxist theories, seem to stand against all this and to provide a bulwark and a global framework for struggle that carried with it the hope of victory, foretold, as it were, in the October Revolution itself. But while global black radicals were enthusiastically allied with and drawn compellingly to the Russian Revolution, beginning in the 1920s and stretching across the next few decades, significant numbers, think James, Padmore, Césaire, most notably, distanced themselves from not only the white-led communist parties within their own domiciles, but the Soviet Union itself. Why is this? I suggest that this was less a rejection of Marxism as a theory of capital and its possible trajectory, as it was the inadequacies, particularly the lacunae on the question of race as a central problematic in global exploitation, and the failure to elaborate a consistent anti-colonial and anti-imperialist praxis from the Comintern and beyond, as well as open racism in some of these parties and racial blindness in the global communist movement and its exorcised relative, the global Trotskyite movement. To repeat then, Marxism as an anti-capitalist lodestone has been, at least since the time of the African Blood Brotherhood, ABB, viewed with great respect, but also regarded critically for its silences around the deeply embedded structure of global racism which preceded it and which were seldom frontally addressed. If we can advance a century beyond the struggles of Hubert Harrison, Cyril Briggs, Claude McKay, Grace Campbell, and all the other leaders of the ABB, the question that they grappled with has yet to be fully resolved. What kind of theory and practice can effectively both explain the insidious power of racism as a hegemonic system and at the same time recognize the debilitating and all-encompassing and possibly world-destroying capability of capital, and to elaborate new theories and a praxis able to provide platforms and methods of fighting it in order to transcend them? And what can we learn from Hubert Harrison, Cyril Briggs, Claude McKay, and their comrades from both their significant and bold intellectual and political initiatives, as well as the inevitable absences in their praxis? The name, after all, was Blood Brotherhood, and women were often relegated to the margins. But I am yielding to Brian Cobo on the question of Hubert and this particular dimension, Hubert Harrison and this particular. That might help us in forging and elaborating novel intellectual, moral, and organizational foundations for the new revolutionary movements that are already effervescing in response to racial capitalism in the 21st century. Among them, I suggest we might want to think of maybe a little agenda of items that we need to address, and among them, I suggest an unwavering attention to political economy, the recognition and engagement with the big picture of global economic and technological movements alongside the local and micro movements of the day-to-day class struggle. The consistent focus and attention as to how capital has brought the world to the edge of the abyss of catastrophic environmental collapse. The understanding of the ways in which race is always inevitably bound up in the hegemonic project and demands a nuanced understanding as to how it works alongside class exploitation to determine structures of domination and the parlous state of people's lives. The requirement that all popular struggles must begin with the people, their expressions, and their movements. The critically imbricated question of gender and sexuality and how they have been historically sidelined, but now demand to be at the center of any narrative of resistance and of all popular struggles. That is my final and only partially answered question in response to what we can learn in this brief excursion into Hubert Harrison, his comrades, and this critical cohort of the Black radical tradition. Thank you.
Thank you, Brian. Thank you, Professor Meeks. So it's about 7:30, and we have about a half an hour for questions and answers. I know there's a large audience as well, hopefully live streams. So y'all, I'm not sure how that process will happen, if people in the audience are able to raise questions. I don't know.
They can raise questions. What I want to make sure...
Okay, go ahead.
What I want to make sure that we get an opportunity to do as well is to, well, first and foremost, acknowledge what was shared here thus far, right?
Yes.
I think that's right. And there were a couple of comments that were raised, and I'm hearing things, and I'm getting to my phone is now at 1%, which is good, which means can't call me in a minute. Can't call me in a minute. And regarding Hubert Harrison, right in this space, right? How do we, you hear me keep saying actionable deliverables, so here in the Virgin Islands, we've had resolutions in honor of him. And we have included him as one of the outstanding Virgin Islanders. We have incorporated much of his work in various parts of the Department of Education's materials and archives, right? There are actual walking trails in the areas where he was born that are properly signed, that share some of this history. Not all in its most accurate and firm space, but at least the intention is in that space. There's been an intention to digitize and to make available as many of his papers that are available. I've done a lot of writing on this, and the reason I chose, when I started seeing like his 400 slides, and I knew that Dr. Meeks was going to have another perspective on saying that, I desired to just kind of let that simmer, and I encourage persons, just begin to go online and look at some of the reservoir of information that exists, right? And show that kind of respect, because we have a habit of not respecting our own. And this is not particular to St. Croix. This is, say it nicely, this is particular to people of African, ancestral, ancient, indigenous culture and engagement. It's something about Black people that we will speak of everybody else. Not maybe those of us in this room, but I'm saying collectively. And we just overlook our own. And in the Caribbean, that has happened. That's not just because of colonization. We just have a way of dealing with erasure and a certain kind of narrative. Well, he isn't that important, and you know he died of consumption, and he was poor, and you know he ain't take care of his woman, especially when you start talking about the free Black love thing, because then it's like, well, he deserves what he get. I'm just telling you, that other part that comes up, right? And that piece with Garvey, and this is coming from someone that's been involved in the Garvey movement most of my life. My father was a Garveyite, definitely not my mom, but definitely, you know, other relatives have been involved in Garvey. And people misrepresent those relationships. Look at the relationships we have now. Think about it. And who's warring with who, and who feel that they know more than that, and how many degrees you have, right? And this is not new. It's sad to say it's not new, you know? And it would be nice if we were to take from this day, June 8th, moving forward, how do we rise up this newfound information that's really not that new? How do we speak of radicalism without making an apology all the time? Well, you know he was radical, but, and you know he spoke his mind, however. You know, we just keep stopping how we look at this thing. And there's a lot of persons in this room that I know can speak to this. And I would be remiss if I didn't include some of their commentary, right? Because that's why we started, even there was a little bit of the glare was kind of difficult for even me to see. But what Jeffrey Perry did, when people speak of the connection to radicalism, I'm just hoping that we are hearing what was said, you know, in addition to what we saw, in addition to the pictures that we have. Because there's a significant, he was like another layer of like a early, 20th century philosopher / nationalist mixed with having the skill set. He taught Marcus Garvey how to speak, how to be an elocutionist. People forget that. So we speak of Garvey in a very respectful way, always honor that. But we forget that it was in those conversations, and it's in record. And so when you say in the Garvey movement, are you following Garvey? You got to include Hubert Harrison. You got to include not only Amy Jacques Garvey, Amy Ashford Garvey, Henrietta Vinton Davis. We can go on. The persons like Claudia Jones. I'm just saying you have to like put all, there's a large, it wasn't just one. We like to use like the one. And I'm not saying we shouldn't be one. I'm speaking of it that we tend to just have like one hero at a time, right? Like we have to be limited. But then like when I hear you speak of free love, then I think of that as terms of the duality and the multiple layers and the intersectionality and the intersexuality. There's some serious things that got said here. I know people got a little uncomfortable. I started watching people pulling. I was pulling on my clothes. I got you because you brought up some stuff. You know, you brought up some stuff. So thank you for giving us another anchor, Dr. Meeks. Because I know people, I mean, honestly, didn't you feel that shift? Because some of these things were things we never heard before, right? And that's what I'm grateful to you, Dr. Carroll, for just having that insight. Because I knew she was up to something. Because it's to bring out what is happening in all layers of our intellectual engagements and sharings. And I'm hoping that people caught that, you know, and didn't get caught up. Because sometimes we get caught up in the, what he say? Wait, I thought this was just going to be like he was born, when he died, what he wrote. You know, wait a second, you done brought up a whole section. I didn't see that in my paper, right? So I just, you know, I think it's important to bring that up. And I would ask while we're doing this, because we can bring the mic to you. Are there 2 or 3 burning commentaries, questions that, yeah.
Of scholarship writers don't really make those hard distinctions just to stay with one or the other. So there's this ongoing integration of a range of perspectives. So for sure, there's one, I'll take maybe 2 or 3 first, and then because of the time. I'll start here.
So you're not going to make any comments?
Oh, sorry, go ahead, Amanda. No, I thought you were just going.
Hi, good afternoon. Thank you so much for a wonderful presentation, Brian, Professor Meeks, and Professor Chinzero as well. So this is a question, actually. I had the great pleasure to actually know Jeff Perry, and I asked him this question, and I thought I could relate it to you as well, which is, why does the Caribbean, and in particular maybe St. Croix on this occasion, how does it manage to instill this sensitivity into so many people that they go to America and become these anti-imperialists, these free lovers, whatever? What is it particular about this moment that so many people are? Claudia Jones, you know, there's Claude McKay. Why is there such a disproportionate number of people from the Caribbean that are sort of taking on this very broad politics, right? I mean, Padmore. I mean, you could go on and on and on. So what is it about the Caribbean, and what maybe specifically about St. Croix that is able to sort of nurture that?
Can I start, if I may, by just suggesting a couple of things? I think this argument is not my own. This is being elaborated by a number of different scholars about the movement from the island to the United States, in particular, to Harlem in particular. And the Harlem dimension of it, Brian, brought up with a significant extent. But it's like, first of all, these islands are black majoritarian islands. There's a white minority who keeps them down and exploits them. But they're black majoritarian islands. The white minority, even as it is exploiting, has to behave to a certain degree, right? Less so at the beginning of the 20th century than in later years, but precisely because they're a small minority, they have to follow a certain modus operandi to make their profits. It's contradictory, but it's real. When you land in the United States and all of a sudden black people are a minority, it's a shock. It's a shock, and not only a minority, but also a minority encumbered by laws and Jim Crow and lynching and all of these things. It's really a shock. It's not that these things, not lynching, but it's not that bad behavior by whites can happen in the Caribbean at any point in time. But they're going to face consequences if they behave too bad, right? I think this is one critical factor. When people are faced with this in a new situation, then they're radicalized. They're saying, what is this? This is extra normal. This is not something that is part of the world I know. And I think this is one thing that stirs them. Across the gamut of not, I speak about politics when I speak about that, but sexualities, maybe just opens a wellspring of radicalism, which then takes on different forms. And of course, in a place like New York, you're going to have, all tendencies are competing for airplay. Everything is competing. And therefore, the possibility, once you have launched into the world of radicalism, to take on, a variety of different approaches to life becomes possible. The other thing I want to say very quickly is that when you come from a small island, it's a tight society. Your grandmother, your mother, the neighbor down the road, everybody knows you, right? What room is there to talk about free love? You're mad, you get slapped, right? It's just this, there's just this big, huge open space in which you can experiment, which didn't exist before. So I just want to put those on the table.
Mic check. I would just add, the point about lynching is something that people like Claude McKay and many others explicitly were just shocked, because that's not so much a Caribbean thing, right? This idea that a massive white people are going to string up a black person in front of white women and white children as well, and cut the penis, take body parts, set them on fire, like, that just blew the minds of many of these Caribbeans who arrived in the US, and I think, again, contributed to the radicalization and the realizing that, like, wow, something is really, really effed up about this society. And, that was definitely a factor in why so many Caribbeans, Garvey and McKay and Harrison and all these folks, became conscious very quickly after they arrived in the US.
I just want to add that there's a ongoing set of histories that when we talk about lynching, it's not new. But in the Caribbean, that didn't go like that. Europeans knew they didn't do that like that in a particular period, and not as a spectator sport, right? And we also tend to overlook what was done in response to that, if it were done. We always talk about what was, how Africans were oppressed and so forth, but it wasn't, everybody didn't get along to be along, and there were times that we resisted. And it wasn't just black people that got strung up. I think it's important to know that.
Yeah, I would just add that all of the scholars I've read in that group, they all said they saw the U.S. and racism in the U.S. as another phase of a global problem. So the assumption was that racism is an international, global phenomenon, and the U.S. at that point was the site of the most intense struggle, and therefore they put their energies there. So you would have critiques of black intellectuals from the Caribbean and activists saying, well, why don't they make the revolution home instead of all of that? But if you think of how the Caribbean looks at the world also globally and internationally and makes those connections, then it should not be lost that we also, in terms of activism and resistance movements, shared a lot of that knowledge. And there's a lot of information about the passing of the information, let's say from the Haitian Revolution to Trinidad to other places. There's an ongoing way in which we shared knowledge and information and did not really create those separate categories in terms of the border, the US national border. So one of the problems is that there's a very linear way that people understand US African American history, and the Caribbeans have been really fundamentally part always of shaping that narrative and broadening it so that it has that global context, so that it has that international context, so that it touches a range of other positions. And I think we need to really say that. But Du Bois said it, it's just this is a local phase of a global problem. Most of the scholars at that time would make similar assertions, as opposed to why are Caribbeans here and why are they taking on those struggles. They saw it as an ongoing issue that we have to deal with wherever we are. So for the first Pan-African conference, the call was about South Africa. These are all people in London, you know, saying, Sylvester Williams and so on, saying we need to deal with South Africa. This has to be high on the list for Her Majesty to figure out what is happening in terms of how South Africa is treated. So we're not local people only, we are local global, we're global or whatever it's called as well by a number of people. Question, sir?
Well, there's a short question and a slightly longer question. Short question, probably get a short answer, which is, when did he pass? When did he die? Do you have a year? Pardon?
1927.
1927. Okay, the question is this. Even though we think of the Red Scare, okay, kicking off, say, the 40s and 50s, as we think of the Red Scare hitting, you know, the country in the 40s and 50s, and people like Robeson and various other radicals of that period of time getting repressed, you spoke about the precursor to Hoover. So my question, the long question is this. Did he ever get threatened? Was he ever jailed? Was he ever attempts made to shut him down through such agencies similar to, or go through something similar to the, because the Red Scare really began well before the 50s. It just kind of crept up on and became on the congressional level, but it began much earlier. So did he ever experience any of these things in attempts to demasculate or
Yes.
take his voice?
Yes. Yes, definitely. I mean, we are often more familiar with the Cold War era, right? The Red Scare of that time, but the first Red Scare was really post-World War I, coming out of the Russian Revolution, which Brian Meeks mentioned, and this fear of Bolshevism that was, this powerful revolutionary force in the world. And yes, Harrison was surveilled quite heavily by the Military Intelligence Bureau, and by the Bureau of Information, which later becomes the FBI. J. Edgar Hoover was very concerned about black radicals of various different stripes. Garvey, of course, is a major target of U.S. intelligence. But many people, Harrison, Garvey, they're all seen as a threat in the eyes of the government. And there's documents, lots and lots of documents, if you go into the archives, that show at times they're tracking these people like weekly. They have a weekly report they're sending in to J. Edgar Hoover, like watching their activities literally week to week to see what they're doing, what publications they're writing, what meetings they're having, what's being said in those meetings, who's speaking in those meetings. Like, it's very extensive, the surveillance on Harrison and that whole generation of radicals. And so Harrison never actually got jailed per se, in part because he was very sophisticated about how to maneuver in the wartime atmosphere, right? So his approach, just in a nutshell, was basically to pretend to take the government at its word when it said it wanted to make the world safe for democracy. And basically within that framework, kind of argue that, well, yeah, we like democracy. What about the South? I mentioned that Liberty League flyer. it was illegal to protest the war. It was illegal to be openly anti-war during the time of the war. So what Harrison did instead was to say, well, yeah, we're for democracy too. What about the South? In other words, take the president's rhetoric and apply it in a different way so that he couldn't be cast as seditious, that he couldn't be cast as disloyal, right? Because there were others who were jailed. You know, Eugene Debs, A. Philip Randolph, Chandler Owen. Some folks did go to jail or were deported, right? There's a whole range of anarchist, socialist, communist, white radicals who are deported. People like Emma Goldman, right? And Harrison was not a U.S. citizen until 1922. So he did face the threat of deportation in a sense, although the U.S. Virgin Islands was technically U.S. In 1917, when the U.S. took from Denmark, they didn't have a clear status. They weren't citizens, but they weren't non-citizens because they were in U.S. territory. So it's a bit of a vague, so sort of a gray area. But Harrison, part of how he avoided jail time certainly was the sort of sophisticated politics of how he spoke during the war and its aftermath.
Okay, cool. We have one question up there.
Yeah, I don't want this to be too similar to that last question, but I do wonder if there's a necessity in sort of investigating the deaths of these free thinkers in a sense, because, well, I mean, I just looked it up, but Hubert Harrison died of like appendicitis on the operating table, which could possibly be because it was the 1920s, of course, or it could be for another reason. And I did a presentation, which was a while back now, on Billie Holiday, who died of cirrhosis of the liver. But if you look into it a lot more, the FBI targeted her and essentially like withheld her health care. So like the demises of these free thinkers was a sort of robbery of so much more that they could have given to us. And is there more of that throughout the free thinking space? So apart from just the threats of the FBI, apart from maybe, you know, MLK getting gunned down, the FBI actively withholding things and withholding the possibilities from these people.
That is really accurate, because I was going to share that earlier. A lot of what was done to our radicals was they were left impoverished. They didn't have the access to certain health care, so things like appendicitis that could have been addressed or clearly identified earlier were not addressed and on the table. If it's going to be save this very radical thinking, speaking person on the table or this puppy, in certain instances, it was the puppy, right? And I'm saying it in a very light way, but it's very deep, because that's what was happening in the early part of the 20th century, and we're dealing with the exact same thing now, where there's these health inequities, yeah? And it's not just a disparity, it's an outright intentional, malicious, it's not a ma'afa, it's a ma'angamizi, it's institutional, it's a machinery, it's systemic. And well, you know, not try to be patient on that one, because I'm saying in the context of what happened with Harrison, it's the same reason that we're still here having this conversation. And when I asked in the beginning how many people know about Hubert Harrison, it was less than half in this room. And that's something that we have the power and the ability to change. The Caribbean is at the center of civilization. I'm going to say it unapologetically. The Caribbean, because it's global. Because we can find people right from St. Croix that's like everywhere. I've traveled a lot on the earth, and I find Crucians, Tomians, St. Jonians, Tortoli. I'm just saying. And if I start looking at flags, I'm going to see a flag of almost Jamaica, Trinidad. I mean, you know, places like Barbuda. I'm just saying, not just Antigua, but Barbuda. We see it everywhere in the world. So it's really critical that when we're having these discussions around great ones like Hubert Harrison, we should be doing this more often. And we should be bringing this type of information up more often and integrating that into across the board of all of our educational engagements, right? But you're going to keep hearing me say that. The Caribbean is at the center of civilization. So that's why when we have these conversations, and I'm glad you brought that point up, we have to think about health. Notice that we said transforming our Caribbean, and we didn't just stop at social science. We were talking about sustainable educational research. We spoke about cultural heritage and historic preservation and creative industries. We talked about environmental solutions. We talked about as much as persons were speaking of health. If we're all dead, all of this don't matter. If we're all dead, this discussion won't matter. Right? So that's why all of these things we're speaking about, and that's a valid point, because that happened to a lot of our radicals, Caribbean and otherwise, that their health, that was the way that they murdered them.
Yeah. I would say you're right. Be somebody like Claudia Jones. I mean, all of them. But you keep in mind, we have to maintain a little bit of that paranoia, because we've seen so many of those repetitions. So I always say have a slight amount of paranoia with caution, that when we raise this question, we say it's possible. What if, you know? Because we've had so many people from Fanon to whoever just leave us in their 30s, and for Hubert Harrison, 44 years old is still quite a young age to die, for sure. Yes,
And
Bob Marley is a good example. Yeah.
Well, I think that was where I was going to go with my question. In thinking that you have the Comstock, and at the same time the weaponization of the FBI through Herbert Hoover, and even with Herbert Hoover having his own closet as well, but the weaponization and the power that he had, including microphones in Dr. King's hotel's room, right, and so on and so forth. And so I wanted to just pose the question around reimagining free love along with black love and what that might look like. And I wanted to just pose that alongside, especially in the Caribbean, and we see what's going on in Uganda, and a lot of that is from radical right-wing Christian fundamentalism. I think that's what we have to call it too, right? And so I'm wondering what that looks like as that's now being imported into the Caribbean, and what it means for our sustainability.
Well, that's exactly why I made the point about African sexualities on the continent, indigenous African sexualities, because people sometimes have this notion that homosexuality is un-African. But this Uganda example shows that actually homophobia is un-African. Homophobia is the thing that's being imported in a vicious way, in a brutal way, because Africans for millennia have had thousands of societies, thousands of languages, thousands of cultures, thousands of kinks, thousands of ways of understanding energy, masculine energy, feminine energy, the relationship between thousands of cosmologies, right? I mean, it's deep. And so I think we have to understand that, like, the Harlem Renaissance is a breakthrough in many ways artistically, but it's also a reclamation of something older. You know, they're drawing resources and sustenance from their own ancestral African inheritances. And that's why I put that slide up there, because we just forget, or we don't know about the wide range of sexualities on the continent before colonization.
Genders. Is there any other question? Yeah, any other question? Yes. We don't have to. We don't have to.
We have transport reminding us.
Okay. So we're good.
We're good.
So,
We're
we are
thankful.
really thankful for your participation, and such a lovely audience you are, and at home and here. And I think this discussion was amazing, knowledgeable, broad, and rich with amazing information circulated. We want to make sure, though, that after tonight, whenever you talk about Caribbean intellectuals, Caribbean radical intellectuals, Hubert Harrison is included in your language. That's the point for me. And I was really pleased to do that with Claudia Jones. Now, anytime they do anything in Trinidad with any historical figures, they always call Claudia Jones. And I'm happy about that. That's the whole idea, because we can't, according to Mali, let them kill our prophets and then we just stand aside and look and watch. We have to find a way that we articulate, we save them, we honor them, we create redemption songs. This is a redemption song for Hubert Harrison. Yes. Hubert Harrison, presente, long may he have recognition here and everywhere else. Yes. I think we did good. Like, let you close it up.
I am very thankful for everyone's participation this evening. We're looking forward to starting again bright and early tomorrow. Keep in mind that Hubert Harrison lives. So if we can just keep that in our heart, keep doing our part, it's wonderful to have you here as we transform our Caribbean. Moving to day 5!
Thank you. And thank you to our panelists,
Thank you
Brian
for our
Meeks, Brian
panelists.
Quoba, Chinjira.
And a
me.
fantastic moderator like no
Thank you.
other, Dr. Carol Boyce Davies.
Yeah, woo.